To my fellow grievers, let me ask you a question. Have you ever in your grief experience thought, what on earth is going on? Is this normal? If so, you're not alone. I've been there multiple times, and it's a really common question that we ask ourselves because grief can feel wild. It can feel like an out of body, out of planet experience. And the thing with grief is it's something that at some point in our lives will touch us all. But it's something where actually we as a society and as a culture are so unprepared for the weight and the processing and the journey that grief brings. So if you're grieving at whatever point in your grief journey, or perhaps if you're supporting someone who is grieving, I'm here today to share just a little bit around our experiences of grief, including some personal shares from me. And my intention for today's episode is really to just show we are not alone in our experiences, and all of our experiences of grief are totally, totally valid. So in today's episode, we're going to be touching briefly on what grief is, as well as how we experience it, looking at a couple of models that I've personally found really, really helpful in rooting me into my experiences and making me see that actually it's totally normal to be a little bit all over the place, as well as looking at how our experience of grief, it shifts over time. And I'll leave you with just a few key takeaways that you can take forwards into your grief journey. So grief is our internal response to loss. On my recent podcast with Megan Reardon Jarvis, she talks about grief as that energy within us. And the thing with grief is it's really, really unique to each of us. It's in fact as unique as each of us humans are. There's never been another human that's walked the planet like you. But also your grief experience will be really, really personal. And I've heard it spoken about of there's a fingerprint to grief. And it's important to note that actually it's not just the fact that our grief experience is unique to us as individual humans, but our grief experience is unique to each of our losses. The way that it unfolds, that journey with grief, that processing, what comes up is very, very unique and can be really, really different. So one death can hit us in a completely different way to another. And that is totally normal. It's also important to say there is no finish line to grief, no matter what your work or anyone might tell you. And there's no rush to, in inverted commas, get over it. In fact, instead, grief, it is a lifelong journey. And what I really find comfort in is the fact that my grief can and has become a part of my story. My grief is woven into me. In fact, when I talk about my grief of losing our daughter, Ngako Rayona, I talk about the tattoo of grief that I feel it's literally tattooed right here. I can feel it right now. It's tattooed right over my heart. I feel it every single day. And there's an acceptance of that grief that is within me. It's totally, totally okay. And the reason that is okay is because I also see my grief as a beacon of my love. And there's a beautiful quote from Francis Weller in his amazing book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which is one of my top 5 books on grief and loss. And he says that grief and love are sisters, woven together from the beginning. Their kinship reminds us that there is no love that does not contain loss, and no loss that is not a reminder of the love we carry for what we once held close. And I absolutely love that quote, that rooting, that anchoring into the fact that grief is a signifier, a marker of our love for those who we've lost. So I also wanted to bring a little bit of awareness to certain misconceptions that spread like wildfire through us and how we talk about grief and how we support each other in our grief. One of these is what you might have heard of, which is the 5 stages of grief. So these were created by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it's really important to share that actually Dr. Kubler-Ross didn't create these 5 stages of grief for our sort of wholesale, everybody's experience of grief. In fact, her research was very specific to patients who just received a terminal illness diagnosis. And those 5 stages were related to their experience, not that of those who were left behind on this earth after they died. So one important thing as we ground into our grief experience is that our grief is completely unique and there is no linear path to grief. So if you're feeling like your grief should fit into a neat box of what that experience should be. I just want you to release that, to let that go right now, because that is not what grief is all about. So as we flow through this, always remember our grief is complex. It's deeply personal. It affects each of us very differently. And so what I'm going to share of these models, of my experience, of how they've integrated, take what feels good, leave the rest, because actually rooting into your own personal experience is exactly what we want as we're journeying through our grief. So first up in the grief models that I wanted to share today, we've got how we grow around our grief. And we often assume that our grief will fade with time. And that is something that is, I think, really, really harmful and invalidating of our actual lived experiences of grief. But Dr. Lois Tonkin had a different perspective to this that has really, really supported me in really understanding my own grief experience. So she suggested that instead of our grief shrinking and diminishing over time, in fact, what happens is that we actually grow around our grief. And if you see this image here, you'll see the jam jars, which represent us, and how actually that jam jar, we grow around that stone of grief. And over time, we create space for joy and for meaning again. But that's not to negate from the fact that that grief remains a constant presence within us. It's just that it doesn't always feel as all-encompassing as it does perhaps in those early stages. And it's important also to note here that our experience of grief can really oscillate and change over time. So like that boulder in the middle of that jar, at certain points, for example, for me, when it's my daughter's birthday, I really, really feel that grief. It comes roaring to the surface, or sometimes actually it's at a time when I don't even have any flipping clue why on earth my grief is surfacing again. So it's also really important to note that actually, again, things aren't linear. So it's not just that, oh yeah, that jam jar always gets bigger and therefore we won't feel that full force of our grief. Our grief can surface at any point, and that is totally normal and totally okay. So for me, in my grief journey, how I've really felt that growth around my grief is an acknowledgement. I look back down the path and I see how far I've come since that roaring pain when we lost our daughter. I've also seen how and witnessed and experienced how grief, it is just omnipresent in my life. And that's not to say that I'm always sobbing and crying. That does happen. And I let that happen when that grief needs to flow in that way and I need to process through and release those emotions. But at any point in time, I feel just that sadness, that tenderness. If I connect in particularly to that tattoo of grief that's within me, I feel it. And I think for a lot of us, when we're supporting those who are grieving, and particularly when we deeply, deeply love them, it can be really hard for us to acknowledge that there will always be that grief that is present within us. But actually, it's really powerful when we can accept that's okay. That's a part of this human existence. And if we can be there to support others, to be able to touch their grief when they want to speak to it, when they want to speak the name of their beloved who they've lost, that can be a really, really powerful place that we can open up some healing for them and some processing, and for them to be able to honor that grief, instead of what often happens in our society is we find ourselves in spaces where we're like, I can't speak about this. I can't speak it to my family, to my friends, at work or wherever it is. The more that we can open up that space, the more that we can really support those who are grieving. And so next up, we've got the dual process model of grief. So this was created by Dr. Margaret Stroebe and Dr. Henk Schut. And this is a really powerful model that explains just how we navigate loss on the daily, how it can shift, how it morphs and how it changes, and how that is totally okay. So they describe two ways that we process our grief. So firstly is loss-oriented processing. So this is where we feel the full force of our grief. This is where we're remembering. This is where we're mourning. This is where we're experiencing the waves of sadness as they come. It's where we're being with our grief. As well as this is a space where we might look to seek support, whether that's through a counselor, a therapist, through speaking to others, through being able to voice exactly how we're feeling. And then on the right-hand side of this model, we've got restoration-oriented processing. So this is where we are adjusting to a new reality. So this is perhaps taking care of practicalities, doing actions, doing organizing, for example, organizing the funeral, were perhaps clearing out our home or their belongings, or perhaps it's also where we might realize that there are new roles and new identities that we need to discover. There's new things in life that we wish to do on the other side of the loss. Restoration-oriented processing is obviously a lot of action and doing, but just a note that in restoration-oriented processing, what we can also find is, when we're those busy bees, but we're avoiding feeling our feelings. And so what we want to have both, because actually, if we're just stuck in one or the other, then that can lead us into avoidance of that which is completely healthy and a normal way for us to process grief. And so in the middle of this model, what you can see in this image is the oscillation between the two, that little zigzaggy line. And what that is that normal oscillation between both of those sides, the loss-oriented and the restoration-oriented processing. It's totally normal. And actually how we oscillate between them and what we're doing will be totally personal and unique to each of us. And it's important that neither approach is right or wrong. And actually that oscillation is really, really powerful, because what we do on the left is we allow ourselves to feel. And then on the right, we allow ourselves to rebuild. So you want to allow, as it comes up, as it feels beautifully in flow for you, that natural oscillation for each of them. And actually, if we resist this movement between each of them, as I've shared, we could perhaps get stuck in one side or the other, which ultimately leads to an avoidance of the other side. And we don't want to get stuck in either drowning in our grief or completely avoiding it, do we? So in my personal experience of grief, I've found this model really, really helpful for me to understand that actually all of these experiences are totally normal. Those days when I don't want to do anything, that is totally normal. That's totally okay. And equally, those days where I spur into action and things feel, oftentimes in the rawest of my grief, weirdly normal, those days are okay as well for me to move into that restoration processing side. And also with that acknowledgement that sometimes I might be more in the loss oriented, particularly in the aftermath of losing our daughter. I spent a lot of time in bed. I've spent a lot of time just being with myself and in that full force of processing and allowing my grief to flow through tears, through wailing, through kicking piles of rocks in the forest and whatever else was coming up. But also it's allowed me to see the benefit too when I feel those bursts of energy and I can move into that restoration oriented side of things. And in my personal experience as well, what I found really helpful, and I just want to share this just in case it's supportive for anyone else, is to have a grief journal. So something that I did really early on, it was actually after our daughter's diagnosis, when we knew that we'd be going through a termination for medical reasons, because unfortunately she had a birth defect that was incompatible with life earthside. At best, she would have lived for 36 hours outside of the womb, unfortunately. And really quickly, and it was actually in the encouragement of my husband, and he said to me, "You love journaling, pick up your pen and journal. Just write all of this down. You don't have to look at it anytime soon, but just capture it and see how that supports you right now." And he was so right. He was so right. It was really, really beneficial. But also what I started to see as I was journaling on my grief was I started to notice not specific set patterns of this is exactly how it all unfolds. As we shared before, grief is not linear. There are no 5 stages for us to flow through. But what it did for me was it showed me that everything in life is impermanent. And that includes those days when I was really, really, it felt stuck in that loss-oriented processing. It showed me that actually there was that natural oscillation, and I'd have one bad day and maybe the next day might feel vaguely normal enough for me to get out, to go for a walk, for me to write the plan for my daughter's stillbirth and then her woodland burial, to be able to do all of these things and to understand that there was that natural impermanence and oscillation between each of these. And I think when we root into that impermanence of everything, I found that really, really powerful, because actually when we root into the fact that everything in life is impermanent, we realize, including this pain is impermanent. It doesn't last forever. And when we can realize that, much like when I was going through the birth contractions for our daughter, I realized that those contractions, that raw searing pain, was impermanent. And then I had the relief of that bit between contractions, but equally much the same, my grief when I went through the raw searing pain. I managed to find a little bit of presence and comfort just through realizing that that pain, it doesn't last forever. I will get through it. I will experience the glimmers of normality on the other side. So as we round out today's episode of Death in the Daily, I wanted to just share a few key takeaways that have integrated just through me, my journey with grief and connecting to these models, and also all the conversations that I have with people about death on the daily. So I've got 3 key takeaways here for you. So firstly, we've got our grief doesn't disappear. It becomes a part of us. And I think it can be really powerful when we can come to acceptance of that. Because actually, when we resist it, I think it can cause us a lot more confusion and hurt. And I really, really hope that we as a society can come to this understanding and acceptance. Our life will expand around our grief, but it's also okay if our grief shows up in really, really unexpected ways. If it floors us, takes us to our knees in a moment, that's totally, totally okay. And that's a totally valid and normal experience of grief. So just give yourself heaps of grace, heaps of compassion and kindness as you journey in your grief, remembering that your grief, it's a part of you, but that becomes a part of your story. And actually, when you show yourself all of that grace, that compassion and kindness and love, that's where our grief can be alchemized into really, really beautiful ways, for example, of understanding what is our growth through this grief. How do we want to change our life? What's shifted for us? That's the power when we integrate grief as a part of us. So second up, we've got accepting that balance between feeling and doing, that oscillation between the both sides, that is totally normal and that is totally okay. Give yourself permission to grieve. Give yourself permission to be low energy. Give yourself permission to just do nothing, to just sit there, to just be. That's totally okay. As well as giving yourself permission to engage with life's restoration and renewal. And this one's really important, particularly as we're looking at that forwards path beyond grief, because sometimes guilt, I've spoken to people before where they've said, I feel guilty in moving forwards without this beloved person. It can be really, really difficult, but give yourself permission, again, with that gentleness, that grace and that compassion to move forwards and to understand that actually that oscillation and having that balance between feeling your grief and doing that is totally normal. That's totally okay. And if one feels more dominant at certain points, again, that is totally normal. That is totally okay. And third up, we've got your grief story is unique. No matter what anyone tries to tell you, if they try to tell you when you should and shouldn't cry, when you should be over this, please, please just tune that noise out, because there is no right or wrong way to grieve. So meet yourself exactly where you are with all of that grace, that self-compassion and patience for this forwards journey. My word of the year is patience. And I'm really, really rooting into that because it's a really, really critical area that I think we can get impatient in life. And I definitely felt that, and equally in this grief journey where we just want to be over it, but just try to bring a little bit of patience and just meet yourself exactly where you are. So finally, we come to my note to self, and I do this at the end of every episode of Death in the Daily. And this is really some self-reflection, some wise words that I need to speak to myself either now, going forwards, or perhaps a version of me in the past. It's a reminder for me on any day for the rest of my life. And it goes a little something like this. I'm going to put my hand to my tattoo of grief where I feel it in my body as I speak these words. My tattoo of grief is lifelong, and I commit to being present with it, to letting it purr and roar exactly when it needs to. So that's my note to self. And if you needed to hear that too, that's an invitation to you. Let your tattoo of grief, let it purr, let it roar, let it just be. Let it be there exactly as it is. And wherever you are in your grief journey, know that I'm sending you lots and lots of love. And if you're tuning into this on YouTube or Spotify and you wanted to drop a note in the comments about how your grief journey is, if you've got any questions, then please do. I love to connect with people. The more that we speak, the more that we can immerse in this grief journey and really, really support ourselves and each other through it. So wherever you are, I'm sending you lots and lots of love.
All of my gratitude to you for joining me for another Dead Conversation. Death on the Daily is edited by David Strutt. The music is Set Free by Katie Gray. And I am Tanya Wilkinson. And if you enjoyed this episode, I would be over the moon if you can rate, review, and subscribe. It really, really helps me to get the word out there. And if you want to say hi or to hear more about my work as a coach and death doula, including how I support my clients to navigate their death on the daily, then all of the ways that you can connect with me are in the show notes. I'll be back soon with some more Dead Conversations. And in the meantime, take good care of yourself and others.
There's a cold fire, there's a crossfire, and there's something